Partus Sequitur Veturum. You're tuned in for those in the cheap seats. The Latin that you hear me speak at the top of my rant simply means that which is brought forth follows the belly or the womb. Now this phrase is very important because it speaks to the barbarous nature of chattel slavery. You won't find this information about the American breeding plantations in any textbook at any school, and it's done intentionally to deceive you. America has always had breeding farms for slaves. Now, during the first importation of slaves, of course, an established order had to be put in place to facilitate the breeding of the slaves. Because see, slavery is about economics, always has been and always will be. Slavery is a tool of economics, is a tool of capitalism. Slavery was used to make America a viable superpower in the world today. Without slavery, America would not be the superpower that it is today, because America would not have been built in such a quick, economically feasible manner as to use the importation of black bodies to build America, even its schools. Let's talk about this tonight. America had to find a way to close out competition when it came to breeding and importing slaves. Because as you can see, once you had slave breeding farms established and slaves were reproducing themselves through natural increase, as well as with the artificial breeding that they were doing of slaves, the slave owners had a self-contained economic system within the shores of America. They didn't have to trade with any nations outside of America when it dealt with slaves. They had commerce within our borders between different states and different slave owning plantations and slave owners, that they had a little self-contained system that they didn't really need any outside help with sustaining the economic base of slavery. So you had, of course, famous slave owners like Thomas Jefferson, who actually came up with this bright idea of how to close out the competition for American slave owners. So what they did, or what Thomas Jefferson did, he authored the 1808 Act, which actually banned the importation of African slaves. So what this did, it closed out competition. You know why it was important that they had to close out competition? Like I said earlier, they had a self-sustaining commerce system within the shores of America to sell, produce, and trade in slaves. So they didn't need any African slaves anymore to be imported, because they had a self-sustaining system of slaves through their breeding farms. Now, a lot of you may not be familiar with breeding farms, and I'll give you a really quick definition of a breeding farm. A breeding farm was simply a plantation that facilitated women and children and a few male slaves on those lands to produce slaves through breeding. Now, this process and these farms or these breeding plantations were very barbarous, because they had only a few males on those plantations and on those breeding farms, and they would forcibly mate the slaves between one another. Now, a lot of times they would put hoods over the female slaves' heads, so that when the male slave was, having sex with them to procreate, they didn't know who they were having sex with. It could have been their aunt, their cousin, their sisters, and in some cases their mother. The slave owners didn't care. They were just trying to produce slaves. So they didn't care about the incestuous nature of breeding with your mother, your sister, or your aunt, or your cousin. They didn't give a damn. They just wanted more slaves. So a lot of these slave plantations had barbarous acts put in place to ensure mating would be successful. Now, I just gave you a definition of what happened on those farms and those plantations. Just think about that for a moment. How that psychologically will scar a person to not know if you're going in to propagate with someone that could be a family member. You know how psychologically scarring that is? And yet this was done over and over again. In fact, it was done so much that the largest plantations were in Richmond, Virginia, and one on the Maryland Eastern Shore, that these people would actually trade slaves every month in a tune of 10 to 20,000 slaves. Let that sink in for a moment. 10 to 20,000 slaves. Do you understand that? Their cash crop was not tobacco or cotton. Their cash crop was flesh. Slaves. 10 to 20,000 a month. And yet, you can't find this information in any history book, in any school system in America. There's a reason for that. Because while they're whitewashing history and telling you that slavery wasn't that bad, so that when you have the audacity or gall to ask for reparations for the atrocities of slavery and the free labor that America enjoyed for 300 years off the backs of our ancestors, they'll tell you it wasn't that bad. What are you complaining about? But yet, you were bred like cattle. You were bred like cattle. You were traded like cattle. You were treated like any other animal on a plantation or farm. You were dehumanized at every facet of life, even when it came to mating. Cheap labor built America. America wouldn't be the economic force that it is today if it wasn't for the cheap labor of slavery. And yet, these are the same people that will tell you, we don't owe you anything. We don't owe you a dime. And to even go further, to show you that American slaveholders were absolutely adamant about blocking out competition, in 1819 they passed another act where American ships could now not only patrol their coastline and their shores and their oceans or their seas or their waterways, they could actually go and patrol the waterways of Africa to stop slave traders at the source. This is how serious they were about their slave commerce in America. And yet, they will tell you it wasn't that bad. Ask any person who tells you slavery wasn't that bad. Repeat this phrase to them. Partus sequitur veturum. And let them know this is a phrase that was instituted to justify slavery. Chattel slavery. Because before chattel slavery, if a child was born to a slave, it followed their father's bloodline. And their father could work away his debt as a slave to ensure that his children were free. However, with partus sequitur veturum, your bloodline followed your mother, which means if your mother was a slave, you were born a slave and you stayed a slave. This is how chattel slavery was created in America. By ensuring the bloodline of the child was through its mother and not its father, so the child would not be born a slave, but if you follow the bloodline through the mother, the child is automatically born a slave. Chattel slavery, ladies and gentlemen. Again, slavery was about economics, always has been and always will be. That's all I got on this topic tonight, man. Like, comment, subscribe. I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.